Welcome, everybody. This is a critical conversation today. I'm really glad you're here. I'm Jonathan Jacoby. I'm the National Director of the Nexus Project. We equip policymakers and community leaders with the resources that they need to understand and address anti-Semitism and build effective alliances to combat anti-Semitism and protect democracy at the same time. Just so you know, we're recording today's program. There's going to be room for questions and answers at the end. If you have questions, just send them to the host via chat and we'll address as many as we can. This is obviously a fraught moment. Bombs are sailing between Israel and Iran. The Gaza war is dragging on. In this country, ICE agents are rounding up undocumented immigrants in large-scale raids with heavily armed teams and tactical gear. And all of this while we're witnessing a rise in anti-Semitism. We saw the firebombing of a march to free the hostages in Boulder, the murder of Yaron and Sarah at the Capitol Jewish Museum, and democratic institutions in this country facing unprecedented pressures while those anti-Semitic incidences have reached alarming levels. And these are not separate issues. They're interconnected threats that demand our urgent attention and a coordinated response. History teaches us that when democratic norms weaken, marginalized communities, including Jewish communities, often become targets. We are witnessing this pattern today as trust in institutions erodes and polarization deepens, conspiracy theories flourish, and scapegoating increases. The same forces that are undermining democratic discourse are also fueling hatred against Jewish people and other vulnerable groups. So today we're going to explore how protecting democracy and combating anti-Semitism require the same fundamental commitments: defending the truth over conspiracy theories, choosing dialogue over demonization, building coalitions across differences. We'll examine practical steps that individuals, institutions, and communities can take to strengthen both democratic resilience and Jewish security. So, I'm honored to introduce you to our panelists today: Congressman Jerry Nadler, Hannah Rosenthal, who served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Antisemitism under President Obama, and one of our country's great civil rights leaders and thinkers, Eric Ward. And I'll go straight to the questions. Congressman, let me start with you. How has Congress reacted to the administration's weaponization of anti-Semitism? What are the key steps that you and your colleagues should take to counter anti-Semitism and prevent its weaponization, both in Congress, and how do you work with educational institutions that address anti-Semitism on college campuses?
Well, Congress has not reacted well to the administration's weaponization of anti-Semitism. The Republicans passed, we passed in the House, I voted against it, obviously, as did most Democrats, a resolution condemning the Boulder shootings, but connecting that to ICE, saying that just shows that we ought to have more ICE raids, we'd have more effective elimination of migrants from the United States, because after all, it was a migrant who did this. So we ought to blame all migrants. So that was a partisan resolution. They brought that to the floor. They passed it. They were playing politics with immigration. They've also used anti-Semitism to justify their war on higher education. So it's been a very bad reaction.
And what about colleges and how do you think Congress can approach this problem of the weaponization of anti-Semitism on college campuses?
Well, the best thing Congress can do for against anti-Semitism on college campuses is to fully fund OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, which is in charge of enforcing Title VI. And the Republicans have not done that. Instead, they're using anti-Semitism on campus to to advance their war on higher education, to advance their war on colleges. How does it help anti-Semitism to eliminate grants to Harvard or Columbia for research into cancer, or for research into Alzheimer's? They are using anti-Semitism as an excuse to cancel very important research grants.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about what kind of concrete steps we can do to counter that. But let's move over to Hannah for a second. Since you served in your role as special envoy, what are the most significant changes you've observed regarding anti-Semitism?
Well, remember that the position that I held, the special envoy position, happened after the horrible Durban conference in South Africa. And had 9/11 not occurred, this discussion we're having might have been happening, 24 years ago. As I traveled the world on behalf of the Obama administration, we really were looking at anti-Semitism as a cultural and at a popular level. It was not so much going and wagging my fingers at prime ministers or foreign ministers. And the biggest difference that I see is that has changed. That now the very issues that we were dealing with are being embraced by people who have political power. And that's frightening to me. It's frightening. Now we see in our country, I always would fly back from wherever I was, happy to land in the United States. I'd say, oh, what I just heard would never happen here. It would never happen in the States. I always felt so good about coming back home. I could not say that today. Because the things that we heard, if I was in Lithuania and the people were talking about their fears and horrific response to the fact that a parade showed Sig Heils. And they expressed that to me, and I came home saying it would never happen here. And we have people who are in the highest positions of political power doing Sig Heil. We see this administration claiming to represent fighting anti-Semitism, while at the same time they're appointing Holocaust revisionists to the Office of Special Counsel, or the head of HHS who thinks COVID, that there was Jewish conspiracy behind COVID, and the list goes on. You all know the appointments I'm talking about. But it's a totally different landscape when you have people in political power voicing anti-Semitism and refusing to condemn it. There's one other difference that I want to just say. When my stump speech, when you speak on behalf of the president, what you say has to be approved through a million different approval processes. And one of my stump speech points was that a big difference between the United States and what I was seeing around the world was the issue of nationalism. That we had patriotism, we support our troops. We were not nationalistic. We were into recognizing the importance of a pluralistic democracy. And that is another thing I can't come home and say is the case, because nationalism, rather than patriotism, nationalism has gotten a hold of our country and the leaders in our country. And that's a huge difference from when I was the special envoy.
I feel like as we're listening to each of you, it's getting darker. So we're gonna go a little darker for a second, but I think it's important that we see things for what they are. And so I want to kick it over to you, Eric, and just ask you how you handle anti-Semitism as it intersects with other forms of discrimination in this country, and we don't need to create a competition here to understand that there's a lot of discrimination, a lot of prejudice, a lot of forms of racism. How do you handle the intersection?
Absolutely, Jonathan. Thank you for that question. I think first we have to understand that anti-Semitism is a form of racism as it functions in the United States. Jews are not placed as a religious or ethnic other. Often the caricatures and stereotypes position Jews as a racialized other, and that has been the predominant form of Jewish hatred in the United States, I think, and still remains so. So in that way, for those of us in the civil rights movement, if we are opposed to racism, we must also be opposed to forms of anti-Semitism that erupt in our society. But there's another reason that we need to take anti-Semitism seriously. It is not just a form of racial bias. It is also a conspiracy theory. It is a political ideology that places Jews in a worldview that blames them for the world's ills and complications. It scapegoats them. In short, anti-Semitism provides a false narrative around how the world functions. It blames Jews at the center of that malfunctioning world, and it uses it to organize. Now, as a person who has spent nearly 3 decades organizing against hate and bigoted violence, not from a distance, but up close, right? I attended hate group meetings in the 80s and 90s, often before the headlines. I and others tracked the rise of the neo-Nazi movement. Right? We have worked with law enforcement, civic leaders, grassroots organizers, and what we have long warned for decades, particularly since Durban, was that anti-Semitism was not a relic of the past. It was a warning light of what's coming. The truth is that we need to take all forms of bigotry seriously, whether we're talking about Islamophobia, whether we're talking about homophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of bigotry. They are part of the same playbook that authoritarians use to undermine civil rights. The attack on immigrants, the attack on Black communities, the attack on the LGBTQ community, the attack on Muslims. In order to tap into Americans' bias, authoritarians have to tap into a narrative. And the narrative that they have chosen, Jonathan, is anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews. But I want to say one more thing. I, for a long time, have primarily focused on anti-Semitism on the right as not something originating from the right, but being organized by the political right. The truth is we have watched that anti-Semitism unfold in real time. Charlottesville, Tree of Life, Poway, Jersey City, Colleyville, the names pile up, each one a scream in the dark. And for a long time, as I said, that darkness came from one direction. There have been now 2 violent attacks on Jewish people in the United States, an arson attack on a sitting governor. And at least for now, it appears those were not driven by white nationalists. And I think we have to take those as a warning. The truth is that anti-Semitism is beginning to mainstream itself inside all of America. We are beginning to take unconscious attitudes and operate on them. And that is not just a danger to the Jewish community. That is a danger to democracy. It will split the progressive, racial justice, civil rights movements in this country if we do not address the underlying bigotry surrounding anti-Semitism, how it justifies other forms of bigotry. The way to think about it in closing is just simply this, I think, Jonathan. Authoritarians, while they are using anti-Semitism, do not bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They are merely organizing the anti-Semitism that already exists. And anti-Semitism is the key narrative driving authoritarian ideas in American society today?
Jerry, Congressman Nadler, we go to Schultz sometimes together, so I think I can call you Jerry.
Yes.
You know, as I listen to Eric and I think about your track record, your leadership in Congress, right, which is where we focus, and which is where, you know, what really translates the will of the people into policy. And so my question to you is, can you talk a little bit about how Jewish security is intertwined with the security and the safety of other minority groups? And especially what's happening to the coalitions between Jews and blacks, between Jews and Latinos, between Jews and other underprivileged groups. Not that we're underprivileged, but underprivileged groups. What's happening to those coalitions? What do you see happening in the country and in Congress?
Well, in the country, there's a fraying of relationships, which I think everybody has observed. In Congress, there is not. In Congress, it's partisan. And the various minority groups, Asian, Black, Hispanic, Jewish, we all act together. We're all Democrats too. There are a few Republican Jews, but they're just not related to any of this. So in Congress, we all act together. We try to get adequate funding for OCR. We try to oppose demagogic Republican efforts to demonize Jews, let's say, in education. As I said, so we work together in Congress, and at least in the House. In the Senate, it's smaller, but they work together too. In the country at large, I see a fraying.
So let me follow up on that, because I see the weaponization of anti-Semitism. We see what looks like an effort to divide Democrats. And sometimes that's along ethnic and racial lines, and sometimes that's along ideological lines. But, you know, there are factions of the party that get attacked as being anti-Israel. Anti-Israel is translated into anti-Semitic. So where do you see the risks and the dangers in the way in which anti-Semitism is weaponized let's say, within the Democratic Party?
Well, certainly there are Democrats who are very critical of I mean, it starts with people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, but it has really spread because the behavior of the Netanyahu government has been so indefensible. People like me criticize it. So it's hard to tell where criticism of the Israeli, I mean, I'm sure there's still some anti-Semitism, but it's hard to see where that is, because so many Democrats are critical of the Israeli government, including people like, obviously, Bernie Sanders, including people like Jim McGovern and me. So it's the Netanyahu government, from my point of view, certainly is acting terribly. And I think I mean, I don't like when people use the word a genocide with regard to what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. It's not a genocide. A genocide is defined as deliberately trying to eliminate a group. They're not trying to eliminate the Palestinians, but they are behaving terribly, taking their land. We know about the settler violence. We know about what's going on in Gaza, starving in Gaza. So there are atrocities going on.
Thank you. Hannah, let's think about, I mean, you live in Madison, so you're very close to one of the most important universities where there have been student protests and where there's been an assault on academic freedom. But thinking about the protesters and thinking about, I know this is a difficult question, but thinking about the relationships between what's happening in Israel and what's happening on campus. And thinking about how there's an effort to kind of create or equate what the protesters are doing with terrorists. Just share some of your thoughts about those connections.
Well, it's unconscionable to call student protesters terrorists, and that is part of the narrative that's happening out there. It is students having the right to speak out and have opinions that are potent, and many of us are happy to hear them making the statements, and sometimes their statements make us uncomfortable. But it's really, really important that it is recognized as a First Amendment right to criticize another country. We criticize our own country. We criticize policies coming out of Israel. But to equate it with terrorists it's like off the charts. It harms the democracy and the hope that students have the right to speak, and it distorts what anti-Semitism is. So it's a terrible situation. And before I give up the microphone, I just have to say, what is even worse than hearing this weaponization of anti-Semitism coming from the White House and from some of your colleagues, Congressman, is the fact that we have Jewish leaders doing it. Jewish leaders who basically want to equate what's going on college campuses with acts of terror. I am, of course, talking about ADL. ADL, which is an important civil rights organization historically, I do not understand how it can be that the leader of this wonderful organization would equate acts of terror and students speaking their mind. It's, I'll use the word again, unconscionable. And I think that if we let speakers, particularly on behalf of the Jewish people, if we let them completely dismiss what's happening by the right as well as by the left, then it's malpractice. And I lost sleep over reading what was being said by Jewish leaders, because that isn't who we are. We're not willing to give up rule of law and the right for free speech. We're not willing to give that up to ensure safety for Jews. We have been successful, safe, and secure in this country because of free speech and because of a strong democracy. And anyone who's willing to completely disregard the protections we have enjoyed in this country, and for whatever reason, agree with trying to get rid of immigrants and trying to muzzle free speech, it's malpractice, it's unconscionable, and we should be speaking out against it loudly so that no one who is not Jewish and policymakers know that does not represent where the Jewish communities are in this country.
Thank you. Erica, I know you have something to say about that, but I would like to, if you can, ask you to shift after you've made a comment about it. We're shifting a little bit towards solutions. So the question that I have for you is, how do we measure? How do we know what's really going on? You know, when there's a conflation of anti-Israel with anti-Semitic, and the data is incorporated, right, is conflated itself. then we don't know. We don't have a good idea of what's actually happening. So how do we get that idea? What can we do to get better information?
It's difficult. I'm not going to respond. I think what was said is important to stand on its own. I think what it tells us, Jonathan, is that it is possible to oppose violence being perpetuated in Gaza, in Israel. It is possible to grieve for Palestinian and Israeli people, and it is possible to still at the same time reject anti-Semitism and Islamophobia without hesitation or qualification. And we must do this, and we must have more complicated conversation, nuanced conversation, such as happening today and in other spaces. I have been in Europe for the last 2 weeks, meeting with Jews, non-Jews, Muslims, and others. And I can tell you, many of the same conversations are happening here, but it feels a little bit more advanced. We have a little bit of ways to go in the U.S. But I want to get to the piece around why this is important. Then I will talk about how I think we might measure it. It is important because anti-Semitism is seeping into the whole of society. While originally organized, or given organization by the far right, what stays in the margins eventually begins to move into the mainstream. And we are not equipped as a society to recognize what anti-Semitism is and to clearly define the line between legitimate critiques on Israel, critiques of Zionism, and what is anti-Semitism. So we have much work to do to become allies of Palestinians and Israelis. I liken it, Jonathan, right, to the Troubles, to the severe sectarian violence that took place in Northern Ireland, right? These are deep sectarian moments. They are driven by deep trauma, deep violence. And as Americans and American leaders, we are not showing up in the responsible ways that we need to. We can hold more than one truth at a time, and that is not a contradiction. That is integrity. Measuring anti-Semitism falls into the same challenges that fall into measuring any other form of hate violence in this country. We have a federal government under the Trump administration that has gutted and politicized the Department of Justice, right? We have watched over the years as police unions have politicized law enforcement agencies around the country. And that has made a difficult challenge of documenting hate violence even more difficult. And in that void, civil society organizations have stepped in, some attempting to do it free from bias, and others perhaps tapping into those numbers for political position rather than an understanding of what is happening in our society. We have to do better. We have to challenge our local level state governments and the federal government to do a better tracking of hate violence. As I understand it, only 1 out of every 8 to 10 hate crimes are even reported in this country, meaning even if the numbers we are seeing are politicized, it tells us that we have a deep problem in terms of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic violence. And until we institutionalize it, civil society will be left to be able to politicize it and shape those numbers in a way that perhaps moves other agendas. Okay, what do we need? We need to do this. First, I just have to say, I'm not here to tell the Jewish community how to survive. It has done that generationally on its own. I would say that to the Black community. I would say that to other vulnerable communities. What I'm saying to all of us is we don't have to do it alone. And that's what a whole of society approach demands. Not performative statements, not press releases, governance, positioning and moving institutions across government and society to take responsibility. We need schools that teach about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as part of anti-racist education. We need to pressure tech companies to stop treating hate speech as an algorithmic puzzle, right? We need politicians who stop using Jewish trauma, right, as a political prop, to stop placing Jews as the buffers between the haves and the have-nots, so that when the have-nots become frustrated enough, right, the Trump administration allows us to take our frustrations out on the Jews. That is scapegoating. That is using Jewish trauma and safety as a political prop. Finally, I think we can make this even more simple for us as individuals. We know that when people feel seen, when they are invited into community rather than pushed into corners or shunned, they don't just show up, they stay, they build, they lead. One of the things that all of us can do as leaders in this moment is to reject the political sectarian positions of our colleagues who have lost their way. That what we seek to do instead is to expand the circle, not tighten it. This is a moment where each of us should focus less on what divides us and those who are dividing us, and focus more on investing in those who are ready to lead forward together. When it comes to hate violence, we need to work with universities to begin tracking these numbers so that we can bring comparison and debate and criteria to hate crime numbers in this country. Finally, we have to push back on the Trump administration's attempt to use anti-Semitism to bring further repression and to clamp down on free speech and free assembly in this country. That is not a long-term solution to Israel and Palestine, and it is not a long-term solution here in this country, Jonathan. Finally, I would just say this. I want to tell the Jewish community, I understand, I believe the pain that it is carrying, the grief, the confusion, the exhaustion, the sense of betrayal by movements you believed in, by friends who suddenly fell silent, by a left that has too often treated your safety as an inconvenience. I am here to say you're not imagining it and you are not alone. But the answer is not crushing the left in the racial justice movement in this country. The answer is a real debate, a real commitment that seeks to move us forward together. What the Trump administration seeks to do is to isolate the Jewish community, to argue that it is the only solution to these problems. That is not the case. This is an administration that is rife with its own anti-Semitism. And the difference between that anti-Semitism is it is being organized and core to part of the coalition that surrounds the Trump administration.
Thanks. Jerry, I have a question for you, but do you have any thoughts about what Eric just said before I ask my question?
Ask your question.
So, among other things, you've been quite involved in the judiciary aspect, the legal aspect of civil rights, just among other things. And one of the questions that comes up a lot is about intent versus impact, right? So there's a debate. Did he mean to hurt Jews, or was it a political act? Did the shooter in Washington mean to murder just Israeli embassy staffers or not? But but Jews were killed and Jews were harmed. So that's an impact versus intent issue, which I'm sure comes up not only in this case. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, you can often infer intent from circumstances. The two Israeli embassy employees shot in Washington, for instance, were not coming out of the Israeli embassy. They were coming out of a Jewish event at a Jewish community center. So the shooter only knew they were Jewish. He had no way of knowing that they were Israeli embassy employees. So his intent was clearly anti-Semitic. And very often you can infer the intent from the circumstances. Certainly on college campuses, you can see this a lot. And you can see it when people use when they say they're anti-Israel, but they're using anti-Semitic arguments. So you can see this from the circumstances very often.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And we have a task force that's taking up this issue. We might ask you to testify in one of our sessions. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to get to some of the questions that have been asked. And one of them, I think I'll start with you, Hannah, on this. So, whatever the intention, whatever the politics, a lot of Jews are living in fear. And in California, for example, in Berkeley, there are kids in elementary school who are afraid that they're going to be doxxed. They're afraid they're going to be isolated. They're even afraid for their safety. It's been since the Gaza war. There are statements that this is not about Jews, but they are Jews and they are afraid. So how do we address this issue? How do we address this issue in schools and in the education system where it's not a political issue?
Well, when we make sure that the education is telling the truth. As Eric pointed out, kids need to learn about anti-Semitism. They need to learn about Islamophobia. They need to learn about racism writ large, instead of saying, we don't want to have these books, excuse me, because it might make white people feel uncomfortable. It starts with book burning. We've all been to the Holocaust Museum. It starts with book burning. And it's remarkable. I will just tell you a story. I was visiting a friend. It was hot out. We were in a swimming pool and somebody came up to us. And this person was a social studies teacher in Texas. And she said, "You're not going to believe what just happened." I had to review textbooks and for social studies. And she describes this picture of slaves in a ship coming to America. And the headline under it was, "These African people are coming to America for freedom and for jobs."
Oh my God.
True story. If that's allowed to happen, as we know, leaders in Florida and Texas and other places are encouraging a teaching of history that isn't part of reality. It's not in the reality you and I live in. That can't be allowed. We have to fight it. We have to call it out. I think there's a lot of punch pulling that's happening. People are afraid that if they speak up, oh my goodness, it's going to harm the Jews, it's going to harm our families, etc. So we can't allow that to happen. To build on something that Eric said, it's really important that we not only continue to be active and vibrant parts of coalitions, but we need to be building the coalitions. I used to head up a national Jewish organization. And once I got up in the middle of a meeting and said, all we're doing is spending time on who should not be sitting at the table instead of who should be sitting at the table. It's a time that we need to be building coalitions. It reminds me of back when I was the special envoy and I was at a peace conference in Astana. And I had befriended the person who does outreach to Muslim. She was the special representative to Muslim communities, Farah Pandith. And Farah and I decided to swap speeches that had been cleared by the State Department. But they didn't say we had to give the speech that cleared. So when they called on me, I condemned Islamophobia in the strongest words possible, and then gave Farah's speech. And in the next panel, when Farah was there, she condemned anti-Semitism in the strongest words possible. Long story short, it's the only thing the attendees at that Astana conference remember. They remember because it was clear we had joined hands. We had thought this through together. And sometimes who the messenger is sometimes even more important than the message. And so it's like I hang on every word you say, Eric. I always do. Not just because you're brilliant and articulate, but you are not what is expected to be the voice of the Jewish concern and Jewish trauma. So I think the way we have to deal with education and society at large and fighting the administration's weaponization of anti-Semitism is having those very difficult, nuanced, complex conversations we have to have with coalition members. And we have to keep people at the table and keep people in conversation and make sure that the messenger who is saying the education has to include anti-Semitism, has to include Islamophobia, has to include racism and all the bad isms, that some of those people are not the usual suspects. And that's the power of coalitions.
Thank you. And I just want to give a shout out to your former organization, Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is one of the groups that actually is bringing coalitions together, national organizations.
That's the organization I used to head that
Right.
tried to get people away from tables.
Right. So, Eric, I'm going to ask you, we only have a little bit of time and there's lots of questions, and I apologize to those of you we won't get to, but we will address them in some form or another and get back to you. So, Eric, I want to ask you, and then I'm going to ask Jerry, I'm going to ask you a similar question. If you were to put together a group of people, one discrete group of people, where you would try to model intersectional dialogue, intersectional fight against anti-Semitism, racism, and all phobias and discriminations. Choose any sector. It could be art. I know you have a lot of experience with music. It could be art. It could be culture. What would you put together? And just again, I'm going to ask you to do it briefly only because of time. How would you facilitate, or what would you want to come out of that group?
Yes. So I'm not going to pick a sector. It could be any sector, but it could be a culture sector. It could be politics. It could be business, economy. What I would encourage folks is that grouping would be value-centered, Jonathan, not political position. And so I would form it around values. And what I would have it do, and I'll talk about those values in a second, but what I would have it do right now is model what it looks like to be an alliance. So let me talk about what I think the core is right now around an alliance. The Black and Jewish Alliance, I'm not here to overstate that alliance, right? But there is a Black Jewish Alliance in this country, and it has been the bedrock of the civil rights movement in this country. It has been the bulwark against authoritarianism. And what that core group that is interested in continuing to show up for vulnerable communities who are being disappeared on the streets of America as we speak is to recognize that anti-Semitism is not just a prejudice. It is a conspiracy theory about how power works. The whole narrative that is allowing Americans to sit in quiet as people are being snatched off the streets of America without due process is the Great Replacement Theory, a retelling of the anti-Semitic protocols, the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, right? It says that Jews are secretly controlling everything, government, media, banks, and that the only solution is to tear the whole thing down. Now, Jews are not always named. Sometimes it's elites, sometimes it's leftists, but these are code words for Jews. Sound familiar? So let me just say this. That grouping would understand you do not defeat authoritarianism with silos. You defeat it with shared purpose. And that group would fight against anti-Semitism in a way that does not require Jews to abandon their solidarity with anyone. It would believe, right, in a fight against racism that does not demand that Black and brown communities look away from anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. It is a future where no one is asked to choose between their own safety and someone else's dignity. It is not a grouping that you will find on bumper stickers, right, or papers over injustice with polite silence. It would not require erasure or assimilation. It would believe in coexistence that is not cute, but complicated, messy, painful, and real and worth it, because that group would understand that at the end of the day, the alternative is a world where we live behind walls, where fear decides our politics, where we forget how to listen, how to weep, how to love across difference. And that group would not want to live in that world. And I don't think the rest of us would either. The one thing that this group could do is to first come together, whether it's music, arts, culture, politics, economy, and reject the deep sectarianism that is taking root in our country, whether we are talking about Israel or Palestine, how we respond to those who aren't documented in our society, to the poor, right, to the working class in this country. We would say enough is enough. It is time for a grand alliance that draws a moral line against bigotry and inequality in our society. And we should take anyone who wants to be part of that movement for an America that is grounded in equity, that moves us forward together. That can be done in any vehicle. We just have to want to believe that that type of country is possible.
Thank you. So, Jerry.
I agree with Eric, but I would add politicians, frankly. I think it's important that you have left-wing and right-wing politicians who are not racists, who are not anti-Semites, who are not Islamophobics, who can call out those who are, and who can show the power relationships that that develop these things. It's very important that they be there, in addition to the people that Eric was talking about, so that you can show that when a President Trump or somebody else tries to blame everything on immigrants, that we're all immigrants. We all were immigrants. We're all descendants of immigrants in this country, unless we're descendants of Aboriginal people here. So I think it's important to have liberal and conservative, but honest, anti-racist politicians who can use the political system to cleanse the political system, in effect, and to fight the racism that's endemic to the political system in our society.
So, Jerry, the last time I saw you, I was standing in back of you on Shabbos morning at DJ. And so that leads me to my last question, which I'm going to ask each of you. BJ is, for those of you who don't know, is the synagogue that Representative Nadler attends, and that when I'm in New York, I go to. So my last question is, I want to take B'nai Jeshurun. I want to take ownership of spiritual aspiration. I want us as progressives and liberals to have to remember that we also have a spiritual connection. And we also, some of us pray to God, some of us hope. But I remember you're sitting there and you're praying. And so I ask you this: when you go to synagogue and when you think about the state of our country today, what is your prayer?
Well, first of all, when I go to synagogue, I'm praying not necessarily with regard to the country, but my prayer for the country is that we overcome our difficulties. Our major difficulties currently are difficulties of racism and Islamophobia and all the other phobias. So my prayer for the country is that we overcome them, that we understand, that we come to understand the basis of them and how invalid they are, and we overcome them.
Amen. Hannah, your prayer.
I will say amen to what the congressman just said. I'm not a prayerful person. My communications with the Almighty, we argue a lot. I'm a little more, I have 2 biracial Jewish grandchildren, and I worry about their future. And if she's listening, I pray for a time where my grandson won't say to me, Nana, do you know there are people in this country that don't like people with dark skin? But don't worry, I'm taking Ninja Warrior lessons, so I will protect the girls. That is that conversation should never have happened. And that's what I hope for, a time when they will live the kind of life and with doors open that all of us on this call have worked hard to open those doors. And rather than seeing them slam shut, my prayer is that they stay open.
Amen. Eric?
I think my prayer is a reminder to myself, and maybe it is for others too, that while we can't shape all that happens in the world, what we do with horror, what we do with trauma, is about how we carry it and how we respond to it. And that is our choice as individuals. And that choice is also our power in this moment. We don't get to pick our moments in history. We only get to decide how we show up for it. And my prayer is just simply this: that we come to understand we are not the ones waiting to be rescued. We are the rescuers, and we need to pick up that mantle and move now.
Amen.
Amen.
But we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you all 3 of you. Thank everybody who was in this conversation. Urge you to use our resources to guide you through these difficult issues. Remember that protecting democracy is a strategy for fighting anti-Semitism, that the 2 go hand in hand. And let you know that in a few weeks, next month, we'll have another one of these. It'll be one of Congressman Nadler's colleagues, Jamie Raskin, and 2 more panelists. Deeply appreciate your commitment, your love for this country, for the Jewish people, for all Americans. So thank you very much, and see you all later. See you all next month. Bye-bye.